thank you very much for this kind introduction to my talk. I do apologize for talking in English and feel very humbled that you're prepared to listen to me in a foreign language. I'll do my best to speak slowly like my colleague before, and there will be slides to show you where the talk is going, and every now and again there will be a short summary to tell you where my colleague thinks I have got to after each section. Jewish history can be written from outside about the way in which Jews have been affected by the world around them. An external history which talks about their participation and about their suffering of persecution and anti-Semitism, and above all the Shoah, about which we have just been hearing. But what I want to talk about is the subject of my book, on the based on their distinctive notion of their relation to their God. And I'll be taking themes from the history of Judaism, in particular this one, looking at the extent of variety within Judaism, why there are so many different types of Judaism now, and have been for the last 3,000 years. So a long history of Judaism, and the extent to which Judaism has changed. And the biggest lesson I would like people to learn from the book is a simple lesson. It is, don't simplify. When you try to understand another religion, don't make it too simple. No religions are simple, nor are people, and nor are cultures. So, what is Judaism? Actually, that's a difficult question. What is a religion altogether has been much debated by students of religious studies. No time to discuss that now. But we can say that it is a religion of a people, the Jews, over more than 3,000 years, which according to their founding myth, that's to say, the way in which Jews have understood the nature of their relation to God, began with a covenant between God, an agreement between God on Mount Sinai by Moses during the Exodus from Egypt. So it's a religion of a people which has developed over 3,000 years through the impact of the surrounding peoples among whom the Jews have lived. And since the Jews have lived in most corners of the world over the last 3,000 years, the history of Judaism becomes something like a world history. You have to understand the wider world in order to understand how Judaism has developed within that wider world. But Judaism is also a wider history than just the religion of a people, because Jews have accepted outsiders, converts to Judaism, since at least 200 BCE, so for well over 2,000 years. But quite why that happened in the 2nd century BCE, the idea that a non-Jew could take on Judaism and become part of the people of Israel is a puzzle. It's not clear, but it is true. And it has been accepted within all streams of Judaism for the last 2,000 years. 2,200 years ago, there was still a bit of debate about it, but not for the last 2,000 years. Interestingly, this acceptance of conversion has never, within Judaism, combined with a mission to make people who are not Jews become Jewish. This can be surprising in a Christian culture, where the assumption of a mission to outsiders was integral to the early church from the start. But it doesn't seem ever to have been true of Judaism, even 2,000 years ago. And that's perhaps not so surprising 2,000 years ago, because in that case, the unusual religion in being missionary was Christianity. So there's a separate question, an interesting question, as to why the early church sought to find converts to Christianity, but it's not something they simply picked up from their Jewish roots. I can hand over to my colleague for a summary.
Allora, un rapidissimo riassunto di questo primo passaggio. Quello che ci propone è una storia interna dell'ebraismo, cercare di rispondere al perché tante varianti e tanta varietà abita il giudaismo. Per affrontare questo tema c'è un caposaldo, una lezione fondamentale, un ammonimento, quello di non semplificare. Non si può mai semplificare quando si affronta una religione, una cultura o una fede. Questo vale anche per comprendere questa varietà. La prima cosa che va detta quando si domanda cos'è il giudaismo è quello che ha alla sua origine due tratti fondamentali. Uno è quello dell'alleanza del Sinai, il patto stipulato fra il popolo e Dio all'uscita dall'Egitto, dall'Israele, e l'altro è l'elemento che deriva dal fatto che l'impatto che hanno avuto le altre culture e società sull'ebraismo è stato forte. Questo fa sì che la storia dell'ebraismo sia in certo modo una specie di storia mondiale globale nel quale si affrontano tutti i diversi aspetti che attraversano la nostra società. La caratteristica che l'ebraismo porta con sé però è anche un'altra, un suo proprio universalismo nel quale, a differenza di quello che accade nella fede cristiana, che in questo non ha seguito la sua matrice ebraica, c'è un'accettazione della conversione, ma non c'è un'azione di missione. La conversione viene accolta ma non viene sollecitata, e questo aspetto è un tratto qualificante al quale fa riferimento.
I have to say it sounds better coming from you. Thank you. So, by definition, there was a history of Judaism. It will be obvious, of course, that the religion of Abraham 3,000 years ago, or whenever we think Abraham lived, or indeed Moses, is not the same as the Judaism of Jews living now. So the idea that Judaism has developed should seem obvious, but it's actually rather less often stated than one would imagine. Its origins lie in around about 2000 BCE in the history described in the Bible, in the Old Testament. So, the deserts in which the children of Israel wandered, the tribes into which they organized themselves, and the empires of the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians among whom they lived. And what they settled down to, by the time that we can identify a distinctively Jewish way of worshipping, is worship of God in a temple in Jerusalem, a single place to worship the single God. Didn't happen quickly, but it happened by the end of the Iron Age, so the middle of the first century, first millennium BCE. That notion of temple worship, of worshipping with sacrifices of animals, libations of wine and of oil, offerings of grain, that was the standard way to worship gods in the ancient Near East and in the Greek and Roman world. This is the normal way to worship, and to this extent, Jews were just like everybody else. But the second element that had developed by the middle of the first millennium BCE, so in the end by 200 BCE, the formation of the Bible was not standard. So the idea that there would be a distinct set of books, 22 books, we're told by the Jewish writer Josephus at the end of the first century AD, 24 books according to the rabbis, depends how you count them, the books of the Bible, the idea that these somehow contained a special truth which was more important for the development of the religion than the many other books that Jews wrote is unique in the ancient world at the time when Jews formed the Bible around about 200 BCE. And this is the Bible of a people who were living in a special land, the land of Israel, which according to the biblical text itself had been promised to the people, to the Jews, by their God. So it's their special land, the Holy Land. Though the term Holy Land, the idea is it is terra sancta, is not actually used until very long into the Jewish tradition. But the notion that this is a special land linked to the Jewish people is there from the start. It's all the more striking that much of the Bible was actually produced by Jews not living in their special land, but living in the diaspora. So already in the 6th century BCE, 586 BCE, the exile to Babylon, we have Ezekiel, the great prophet, crying by the waters of Babylon, producing the basic texts which were going to create the nature of Judaism. And that theme, the relationship between diaspora and land, is to continue in the development of Judaism for the next 2,500 years. By 200 BCE, the world in which the Jews lived was under Greek rule. This is after the conquest of the great Macedonian king Alexander the Great in the late 4th century BCE. The effect was to change the way Jews understood their religion, partly through the adoption of the Greek language as a way of expressing their religious texts. And as they did so, they brought Greek ideas into the way they understood their fundamental notions. In due course, this was to lie behind the way in which Christianity was itself to express Jewish ideas within Greek. In 70 CE, the impact was no longer Greek but Rome. Rome had arrived in Palestine and Judea in 63 BCE with the great general Pompey the Great. By 70 CE, Roman rule had gone wrong, seriously wrong, and Jerusalem was sacked by the Roman general Titus, the future emperor Titus, and you can see his arch in Rome today. It left Jews without a temple. Now, Jews have been without a temple since 70 CE down to the present. This has an effect upon Judaism which is fundamental. I began by saying that temple worship was standard in the ancient world. temple worship is also mandated, it is required by the Bible. That is how you're meant to worship, according to the biblical text, if you are a Jew. God would like to have sacrifices on his festivals, on his Sabbaths, and on his new moons. There has been no temple for 2,000 years, and Jews have adapted to a world in which they cannot worship properly according to their own sacred texts. It wasn't obvious this was going to be the case. The destruction of a temple in the ancient world was quite common, usually by accident. The fact that the Romans did not allow the temple to be rebuilt is a factor of a result of Roman politics, not of the behavior of the Jews. But it did mean that by the time that the Roman state became Christian in the 4th century, under the Emperor Constantine, Jews were already adapting to having no temple, and a Christian Roman state was clear that the lack of a temple was important as a demonstration of what the great Christian theologian Augustine called the Jews as testes veritatis, as witnesses of the truth, by which Augustine, at the end of the 4th century, the beginning of the 5th, meant that Jews lived under the rule of others in a state of subjection because of their rejection of Christ. And that notion within Christian society was to continue right through the medieval Western European Christian tradition down into the early modern period. Moving rapidly through the rest of the history, Jews in Babylonia produced the Talmud in around about 600 CE, and at the time of the rise of Islam, were producing not just the Talmud, but canonizing the Talmud as the best interpretation of the biblical text for all Jews under Islamic rule. And that's included by the first half of the second millennium CE, from 1050 down to 1500, just before, all North Africa, much of Spain, of course, under Islamic rule. And it is under that Islamic rule that the Talmud and the interpretation of Rabbinic Judaism spread. It is very difficult to overestimate the importance of Islamic ideas on the development of classical Rabbinic Judaism. And it's one of those sort of secrets of the sources behind the development of Judaism that has been much overlooked in scholarship on this subject. In the meanwhile, in France, Germany and Italy, under Christian rule, Jews took on ideas from Christianity. The early modern period, Italy became a major centre for the development of Judaism, not least because of the invention of printing and the significance of Venice as the main place where printed books, Hebrew books, could be printed and distributed to Jews all over Europe and down into the Islamic world. And Venice as a place where Jews from many different traditions met and interacted, so coming from Spain, coming from Northern Europe, and coming from further east in Istanbul and Palestine. At the same time, there was a move of Jews from Western Europe further east into Poland and what was become the Pale settlement in Russia. The great Eastern European Jewish populations are a product of the early modern period, and it's from them that most of the most influential trends in Judaism of the 17th century were to emerge. And then finally, the challenge of the modern world from 1750 down to the present, the reactions to the Enlightenment, particularly in Europe and the United States, there doesn't apply for Jews living in Islamic lands, like the huge Jewish community in Yemen, which managed to ignore the Enlightenment until comparatively recently. The Shoah, about which we've been hearing in Europe, and then, of course, the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948. So all these changes to the Jewish people have had an effect upon the development of Judaism. Good luck.
Allora, siamo partiti dalle origini della fede di Israele fino ai nostri giorni, da un'origine che si colloca in un mondo di imperi, degli imperi antichi e delle culture del deserto, quelle culture tribali, nelle quali ci sono due aspetti che il professor Goodman mette in luce. Da un lato un aspetto comune, anche la fede di Israele si dota di un tempio, come tutte le fedi del mondo antico, ma incomincia a dotarsi anche nel primo millennio a.C. Di un testo, la Bibbia, i 22 libri che la compongono, che sono qualcosa invece di originale, che non appartiene a tutte le tradizioni religiose, anzi a nessuna. E dentro la Bibbia, che è scritta fuori dalla terra di Israele, che nasce l'accentuazione della terra donata, della terra promessa, come luogo nel quale si compie quello che era la promessa e il dono di Dio. Questa cultura biblica che mette al centro la terra viene, incontra con l'espansione di Alessandro Magno quello che è il mondo di lingua greca e adotta il mondo della lingua greca, traduce la Bibbia in un testo greco, quello della 70, la popola di idee greche, che saranno poi quelle su cui si baserà anche quello che viene chiamato il Nuovo Testamento, fino all'arrivo di quello che è l'invasione romana, che fa il 63 a.C. con la conquista fino alla distruzione del Tempio del 70 da parte di Tito, segna in maniera estremamente profonda, perché costituisce l'ebraismo che ha perso il Tempio. Un Tempio, prima di tutto, non è anche questa un'esperienza originale, fa parte della tradizione di tante comunità di fede, e ci sta anche il fatto che la politica romana lo vieti, ma il problema è quello che questa distruzione e assenza del Tempio diventa marcante identità stessa del giudaismo da un lato, e dall'altro diventa la riprova della catechesi cristiana del disprezzo, quella di Agostino, sul fatto che la mancanza del Tempio rivela il castigo che è stato inflitto a chi ha rifiutato la fede in Gesù. Le tappe successive che messe in luce sono quelle della formazione della Torah orale, del Talmud, dell'ebraismo babilonese, e più in generale l'impatto che ha la vita sotto le regole dell'Islam, perché, dice Goodman, il giudaismo rabbinico, così come noi oggi lo conosciamo, è determinato in maniera molto forte dalla sua concezione e origine all'interno del mondo islamico, a confronto invece di un ebraismo che nelle terre cristiane, sotto leggi cristiane di discriminazione, nell'Italia, nella Francia, nelle terre tedesche. Il mondo moderno vede l'ebraismo in queste terre segnato dalla diffusione della stampa, e quindi dalla possibilità della distribuzione della cultura, che genera anche conflitti e contrasti nuovi, dall'altro dell'insediamento nell'Oriente europeo, fra la Polonia e poi nella Russia, di un altro giudaismo influentissimo che da quel mondo isolato fa arrivare una voce nuova e originale all'interno del mondo ebraico, e prima dell'impatto con la modernità, nel quale l'emancipazione illuminista segna sia la storia europea che quella nordamericana dell'ebraismo, fino ai tempi della Shoah e della fondazione dello Stato di Israele, che cambiano il quadro di questa varietà di cui ho parlato all'inizio.
So, for all these forms of Judaism, which have developed over the last 3,000 years because of all these different changes to the history of the Jews, there is a common core. The common core is very simple. It begins with the notion of the covenant between God and Israel, which I mentioned at the beginning. The covenant is like a marriage. So it is, the metaphor is used only occasionally in the biblical text, but it is used, of God as the husband, Israel as the wife, with the assumption that there is an agreement between the two, that's what a covenant is, that if the bad partner, which is Israel, disobeys, then Israel will be punished. But that in the end, the covenant will not be broken by either side, by God, unless Israel behaves unbelievably badly, which is taken for granted that Israel will not do. So there's the notion of grace in Christian terms that lies underneath the notion of covenant at all times. So the covenant is taken for granted in all these different forms of Judaism, and the prime expression of that covenant is in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, which is sometimes itself called the Torah, which is a wonderfully adaptable word to describe the way in which Judaism expresses itself. So the Torah is the law, it is also the teaching, it is a shorthand for Judaism as a whole. The question of who the God of the Jews is was something that puzzled Greeks and Romans. The great philosopher, quite great philosopher, Plutarch, wrote a treatise asking who is the God of the Jews, and decided that he was probably the Greek god Dionysus, because the Jews are really interested in grapes and wine. He was not right, but it's interesting that he asked the question. As far as Jews were concerned, God is the divinity whose actions are described in the Hebrew Bible. So God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he is the God who was worshipped in the temple in Jerusalem until 70 CE. Now the reason why they don't have to specify more precisely who is the God who they worship is because the Jews, unlike everybody else in the ancient world, were not polytheistic. They did not worship lots of different gods. In the eyes of Greeks, Romans, and others in the ancient world, this was simply mad. It was very, very odd to imagine a world in which there is only one divinity that you worship, when it is quite obvious that the world is full of other divinities. It would be the same as somebody saying there is only one germ that causes you illness and ignoring all the others. We can't see germs, we cannot see gods. But in both cases we deduce from their actions. And polytheists assumed that you could see the actions of the gods in the wider world. Jews were very odd. They worshipped only one of those gods. Why do they worship only one of those gods? The answer is simple, and it is in the 10 Commandments in the Torah. God is jealous. He insists that you will worship only him. Right? So we go back to the marriage metaphor. God is like a husband, whereas within polytheistic religions, God is like a friend. So a friend doesn't mind if you have other friends. A husband does mind if you have other spouses. This notion, I say, very strange for polytheists, different from monotheism, the notion that there is only one God in the world, which occasionally you will find in the Hebrew Bible, but frequently you will find the assumption that there are other divine beings, and in the time under Greek rule, so 2nd century BC, down to the 1st century CE and the growth of Christianity, the assumption that the world was full of demons, of other supernatural beings, was taken for granted by Jews, including, of course, large numbers of angels, who are very nice supernatural beings. The difference between Jews and polytheists, then, is not a different understanding of the makeup of the supernatural world. The difference about Jews is their understanding of the attitude of their God to the rest of the supernatural world, and the assumption that their God will get very angry if they worship these other divine beings. So that's the essence of all these different forms of Judaism. After that, variety. Huge amounts of variety for 3,000 years. And the causes of variety, twofold. One, interpretation of the biblical text, and secondly, the development of new practices, simply by the way in which the religion is lived. Now, the interpretation of the Bible could allow for a great deal of variety, because the Bible itself is frequently ambiguous. The words of the Bible do not give you a very clear way of living, and frequently you are told conflicting things in different places. If you want to know how much of your agricultural produce to give as tithes, you will get instructions in the book of Leviticus and the book of Numbers. Unfortunately, they are different instructions. So you can't get it exactly right according to both of these texts. And that's true of many different areas of life. So, interpretation of the Bible allows for variety, and so too does the development of practice, which is often explained in terms of biblical texts. So when a new practice arises, somebody will go to look for a biblical text to try to justify the change. I should stop there for a brief.
I tratti costitutivi che il professore ha messo in luce sono essenziali. Prima cosa, la convinzione che il patto stretto da Dio è un patto eterno, è un patto della natura coniugale, matrimoniale, è un patto che ha dentro di sé una fedeltà da parte di Dio superiore a quella che riguarda la fedeltà stessa del popolo, che però deve aspettarsi castigo per la trasgressione di quel patto. Prova del patto è il dono della Torah, espressione d'utile perché può indicare sia i primi 5 libri della Bibbia sia la Bibbia scritta in modo completo, e il Dio che gli ebrei adorano, il Dio del giudaismo, è il Dio di Abramo, di Isacco, di Giacobbe, nel senso che appartiene esattamente a quella tradizione, anche se poi c'è un tentativo che viene fatta a più riprese dalla filosofia classica di identificare le curiose identificazioni con Dioniso in ragione dell'uso del vino nel culto. Il culto del patto di Dio che discende dalle scritture è un culto monolatrico, e questo è un'altra delle differenze qualitative del giudaismo così come lo conosciamo. E la monolatria è una cosa anomala nel mondo antico e discende non dall'interpretazione del soprannaturale, ma dall'interpretazione della gelosia stessa di Dio. Anche l'ebraismo conosce l'esistenza di altre entità soprannaturali, di figure divine, degli angeli, ma non è questa la cosa che conta. La cosa che conta è quella che la gelosia di Dio giustifica la monolatria come culto. Al di là di questo incominciano 3.000 anni di varietà. varietà nell'ermeneutica delle scritture e varietà nella gestione delle pratiche. Delle scritture perché la Bibbia fornisce indicazioni volta a volta diverse, a volte contraddittorie, e dunque porta dentro di sé l'esigenza stessa della interpretazione e diversità delle pratiche per ragioni che sono state dette prima, perché da ciascuna di queste interpretazioni discende un modo diverso di articolare quella che è la pratica dei precetti.
So the extent of variety. In different periods of the history of Judaism, different problems have seemed absolutely central to the ways in which Jews have defined themselves. So in the late Second Temple period, that's 200 BC, 70 CE, the time of most Greek influence, the areas of debate were over physical purity as a metaphor for spiritual purity, over the way you should live the Sabbath, over the calendar. Should you have a calendar based on the sun or on the moon? Over how you should keep vows. Questions of when the end of the world was going to come, eschatology. Life after death. Is there any life after death? Will there be a Messiah? And what will he be like? Now, all those questions will be familiar to those who have studied early Christianity, and they are picking up the same kind of questions that pervade all the rest of Jewish literature from this period. These areas of debate were picked up differently by different self-defined groups, and that's a strikingly early element in the development of Judaism. So you could call yourself a Pharisee. Again, Pharisees are going to turn up in the New Testament, or a Sadducee. A Pharisee because you accepted ancestral tradition, the way in which Judaism was lived in practice. You were a conservative Jew. Or a Sadducee because you denied ancestral tradition, and you said you could only obey the written text. So what you might call a little fundamentalist, going back to the biblical text. Or the strange group of the Essenes, who lived in monastic groups and had a special lifestyle all of their own. Or the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian group, those who produced these documents which were found in 1947 down by the Dead Sea and have been interpreted for the last 60 years. So all these self-defined groups emerged by almost immediately after the Bible was finished. So that's an element of the development of Judaism in which they took on different aspects of these wider issues of purity, eschatology, Sabbath, and so on, and took stances on each of them. Some of these Jews fully incorporated Greek ideas, as the great philosopher Philo did. How do you do that into Judaism? The answer is by allegorizing. Allegory means to say, allegoria in Greek, means to say that one thing means another. That's all you have to do. So you say A means B, and if you do that, you can make any meaning you like out of any text. And that's what Philo did, managing to make the Hebrew text mean the philosophy of Plato, the great Greek philosopher. And then finally, among the history of Judaism in this period, John the Baptist, who took more seriously than any other Jew we know in this period the notion of purification, physical purification, as a form of spiritual purification, which is why he was called John the Baptist, John the Baptizer, because he went into baptism. And then too, Jesus and Paul. All three of these figures, who we know from the New Testament, though we also know Jesus and John the Baptist from Jewish sources like Josephus, All three of these figures should be understood within the history of Judaism, as well as within the history of burgeoning Christianity. In the Talmudic period, we know most about the development of rabbinic Judaism, which has become the standard form of Judaism down to the modern day. But every now and again there are hints in surviving evidence of the continuation of Judaism expressed and developed in Greek, like Philo had done in his understanding of Judaism as a form of Platonic philosophy. Our evidence is only meagre. We only find it in inscriptions, in Roman law codes, in references in the Church Fathers, in Christian texts. And that is because all our Greek Jewish literature after the year 100 CE disappeared, because the Greek Jewish literature before 100 CE was preserved not by Jews but by Christians. And Christians, after the end of the first century, had no more interest in hanging on to Jewish writings in Greek if they weren't also Christian. And this brings us to a major problem in understanding the history of Judaism, as indeed all history, which is the very partial way in which the evidence is preserved by the later traditions. From 600 down to 1050 in Babylonia, talk about the impact of Islam on the spread of rabbinic Judaism. So within the Islamic world, in Arabic, that rabbinic Judaism spread, and it evoked the Talmud and the rabbinic schools that taught it. It evoked a response by some Jews, the Karaites, who wanted to go back to the biblical texts and who completely rejected the Rabbinites. Karaite Judaism continues down to the present day. There are very few Karaites, but there still are some. And their distinctive form of Judaism was to be found not just in the Islamic world, but eventually in Eastern Europe, in Russia and in Poland. Rapidly in the medieval period, the development of specialists in Jewish law, those who used Islamic philosophical ideas to understand their Judaism, and the development of Jewish mysticism in the Kabbalah, the classic text of the Zohar, dated to around about 1300. It must be emphasized that these developments were often by the same rabbis. So the same scholar could be an expert on Jewish law, a philosopher, and a mystic. They might do it at different times, and they would write different works, but they didn't see them as mutually exclusive, or not normally. In the early modern period, 1500 to 1750, the growth of codes and of a distinctive type of Kabbalah in Palestine, and then the type of mystical Judaism best known in the modern world of Hasidism, a product of the 18th century in Ukraine, which was an attempt to get right back to a pious form of Judaism. So Hasid means a pious one. How to get back to being pious without having to be learned. So you didn't have to go and study the Talmud in order to be pious. And that in turn provoked a response to meaning the opponents. We saw this rejection of rabbinic learning as itself dangerous. And then the reactions to the Enlightenment, the separation of religion from secular life throughout Europe, Jewish emancipation. And as a result of that, the emergence of new denominations within Judaism, a reform type of Judaism which tries to incorporate modern European thought into Judaism, and a counter-reform which had to call itself orthodox in comparison, and then the rejection of all kinds of reform by those who call themselves relating for the pious ones.
Ora, ripercorrendo ancora la storia dal secondo tempo in qua attraverso questa cifra della varietà, noi incontriamo all'inizio una discussione che è quella che riguarda le tematiche della purità, le tematiche del calendario solare, calendario lunare, le tematiche dei voti, le questioni escatologiche che generano diversi tipi di movimenti, alcuni dei quali conosciamo anche con dei nomi identificativi, il gruppo dei farisei, il gruppo dei sadducei, i gruppi monastici degli Esseni o gruppi come quelli di Qumran, gli uomini del Mar Morto, nel cui grotto del 47 furono trovati scritti molto antichi. Ma conosciamo anche un ebraismo di lingua greca, quello espresso da Filone di Alessandria, e anche altre forme di giudaismo che hanno a che fare esattamente con quei punti. Quello di Giovanni il battezzatore, che è un purificatore in senso stretto e tecnico, l'ebraismo di Gesù, l'ebraismo di Paolo, che appartengono tutti alla storia del giudaismo a pieno titolo. La fase successiva, quella del 70-100, è identificata proprio su Goodman con il giudaismo rabbinico del Talmud babilonese e il giudaismo di lingua greca, che conosciamo meno perché le sue fonti sono state disperse, conosciamo solo attraverso le portazioni che ci fanno i padri o iscrizioni o non tante altre cose. E il giudaismo rabbinico, quello che dopo il VI secolo si afferma e si espande sia nel mondo islamico che nell'altro, e nel quale si manifestano però anche da subito fenomeni di ritorno, come quello dei Caraiti, le correnti che domandano una reversione alle forme pure antiche del culto, e ha citato quelle correnti del mondo medievale, gli anarchisti, quelli della filosofia, e poi più in generale quello della mistica ebraica, della Kabbalah, fino alla scrittura dello Zohar attorno al XIV secolo, e lo sviluppo di modernità che ha alcuni punti importanti che ha citato, soprattutto quello dei Hasidim del XVIII secolo, che rappresenta una corrente di grande importanza per la mistica ebraica. La reazione dell'illuminismo genera a sua volta delle nuove varietà fra un ebraismo riformato, un ebraismo ortodosso, l'ebraismo dei Pi, gli Aledim, che sono quelli che rifiutano qualsiasi forma di influenza e di intromissione della modernità nella pratica dell'osservanza.
Two more slides to finish us off.
Le ultime slide e poi finiamo. Se ci fate la cortesia del silenzio, siamo grati. Tutti però.
So what I want to emphasize to finish us off is the relationship between these varieties. So I talked about how different they all were. And it is clearly the case that sometimes they were hostile to each other. So we're told by the Jewish historian Josephus that Pharisees and Sadducees frequently argued against each other. And we have stories about such arguments in the book of Acts. In Acts of the Apostles, Paul in front of the Sanhedrin, with Pharisees and Sadducees arguing. Rabbinites and Karaites also argued. The great leader of Egyptian Jewry, Maimonides, the greatest figure of the medieval period, referred to the Karaites sometimes as Melim, or heretics. Hasidim and Einaudi sometimes fought each other. So there are stories of the great leader of the Hasidim, great civic leader, being put into prison by the Russian authorities, the authorities of the Tsar, because he'd been told on by Einaudi. Reform and Orthodox argued with each other. There's one case, indeed, of murder in the 1840s in Lemberg, where a Reform rabbi was poisoned by an Orthodox Jew within his city in Lemberg in the Beach. But these are the exceptions. And what I want to emphasize is that these same groups manage to tolerate each other in a way that is not standard in the history of religions. So Pharisees and Sadducees disagreed on a great deal of their interpretation of the law, but they shared the one temple in Jerusalem. At any one time, one of them must have been carrying out their festivals on the wrong day, probably the Sadducees, because we're told that the teachings of the Pharisees were those that were followed. So we have two self-defined groups who think they are right, but they agree to put their arguments on one side in the single temple where they all worship God on behalf of Israel. The same Maimonides, who said the Karaites are heretics, nonetheless represented the Karaites to the Islamic rulers of Egypt in order to protect their interests within the Islamic world. And when he wanted a really good Sefer Torah, a really good copy of the law, it was to a Karaite scribe that he went, because the Karaites, as Bible experts, were really good at copying the Bible text. Similarly, by the 19th century, Hasidim and Mitnagdim in Eastern Europe were marrying each other. They were all equally appalled by the increasing emancipation of Jews in the Reform world, and therefore they saw they had more in common than others. And the same is true of Reform and Orthodox, who gathered together in particular in more recent times in support of Israel and in their relations to the Shoah. But if there has been a history of toleration within Judaism, that there are causes of increased intolerance in the modern world. One is secularization and assimilation. So most Jews are not particularly religious, and many are more assimilated into the wider society in which they live, and they may not anymore see reason to be tolerant of the Judaism of other Jews. Another cause is the state of Israel and the relation between Judaism and secularism within the state. So the state is a secular state that has established a sort of state religion in which there are religious activities carried on under the auspices of the state in a very uncomfortable way, established at speed in 1948, at the time when the state was founded, and not properly updated since. Zionism as a secular movement has related uncomfortably to the desire to return to the land of Israel, which has been a religious desire within Judaism for centuries. So both the state of the wider world in which Jews live in the diaspora and the state of Israel create tensions among Jews that were not there until recent years. So too has mass communication. So it was noted already in the 1970s and 1980s that Jews increasingly found their religious education no longer from their family and from their parents, but from books. And so people were relearning their Judaism from books which told them how to behave. That has increased hugely since the rise of the internet. So the availability of different types of Judaism, local types of Judaism, which flourished for 2,000 years, has been under threat as the internet imposes uniformity among Jews who aren't quite sure what they should do, and they look at the internet and they find what looks like authoritative teachings, but may come from a different tradition altogether. In the meantime, Jews are still waiting for the Messiah. Every now and again, over the last 2,000 years, some Jews have decided that the Messiah has arrived. This happened really quite recently, 1992, with the Lubavitch Rebbe, and they remain, this is one of the forms of Hasidism that came out of the 18th century poem. The responses to the end of the world and the Messiah not having come have been very interesting in that Lubavitch rabbis remain extremely influential within Orthodox Judaism, even though most Jews think they were wrong about their understanding of who the Messiah was. All of which means that understanding what the future is going to bring is extremely difficult to tell. Fortunately, that's not the job of historians, but it is the job of historians, and I hope I've done a little bit of it today, to show what is possible within a religious tradition.
Allora, gli ultimi due punti della lezione del professor Goodman riguardavano il fatto che tra gruppi, quelli che abbiamo visto di questa varietà ebraica, ci sono state sia delle forme di ostilità fra faresi e sadducei, fra rabbaniti e caraiti, fra sidin e medardim, fra ebrei riformati ed ebrei ortodossi, con anche degli episodi in cui l'ostilità è diventata molto forte, molto netta, l'avvelenamento di un rabbino riformato, un padre ortodosso a Libro del 1940 che è citato, l'arresto del rabbino Cassidim da parte della polizia israelista. Però all'interno di questa varietà si è realizzata anche una forma non standard, dice il professor Goodman, di tolleranza. Tolleranza tra farisei e sadducei che condividevano lo stesso tempio, tolleranza fra rabbaniti e caraiti, questi ultimi grandi copisti della Torah, a cui si chiede protezione in Egitto, tolleranza fra Sidino e Dadim dell'Europa orientale, dove il fenomeno dei matrimoni misti, diciamo così, tra i due gruppi è forte, e intesa fra riformati ed ortodossi, ad esempio nella lettura della Shoah. Allora, perché esiste un contrasto crescente e un'ostilità crescente? Ha indicato 4 punti finali. Uno, la reazione alla secolarizzazione che introduce nuovi elementi di comprensione del giudaismo. L'altro, la nascita dello Stato di Israele, con tutti i problemi che pone l'espressione di un giudaismo, di una secolarità interna allo Stato di Israele, e i problemi della coabitazione e convivenza tra quello che è il sionismo e il giudaismo non sionista che nello Stato arabo. E poi c'è un problema soprattutto di comunicazione che riguarda il presente e in un certo senso anche il futuro. Anche nel giudaismo di oggi la trasmissione religiosa non è più attraverso la famiglia o il rabbino, ma passa dal web, passa dalla riscoperta attraverso la lettura dell'ebraismo reimparato sui fondi, e passa da quei momenti di rinnovamento spirituale ad alta temperatura religiosa che attraversano anche il giudaismo. E sullo sfondo resta la questione della convinzione della venuta del Messia, il caso più recente, quello del gruppo dei Lubavitch, che nel 92 hanno riconosciuto nell'Orente il ritorno del Messia. E ci interessa dire se questo è giusto o sbagliato. No, dice il professor Goodman, il futuro non è il mestiere dello storico, ma il suo mestiere è quello di indicare la varietà del possibile che può abitarne, quello che ci ha fatto vedere questo pomeriggio, e come questa varietà abiterà anche il futuro del giudaismo, io ancora lo ringraziamo molto di questa soluzione. Come diceva Fantozzi, il dibattito d'oro. Che siamo vicini al salvamento delle risorse epigeniche della platea.
Alcuni ragazzi devono partire perché hanno il pullman. Innanzitutto ringraziamo tutti e ci scusiamo anche un po' con quelli che hanno dovuto pazientare perché abbiamo inserito 2 conferenze in inglese nell'ultima parte del pomeriggio, ma questo è dovuto a un fatto di organizzazione e di arrivo delle persone. Domani sarà un po' più leggero, però sicuro, ci sarà solo un incontro in lingua inglese. Se abbiamo a disposizione 3 grandi autori, se volete fare qualche domanda, possiamo fare qualche domanda magari sfruttando